Okay, hello everybody. It is week 5, Thursday, September 24th. I've opened up week 6 so you guys can see what's coming down the pipeline to you guys. But this week we're going to talk about texture and pattern and visual hierarchy. And these two things directly correlate with the assignment that you're going to be getting, which is the texture assignment. You can trim it down in the
Why not just leave it?
Because she wants it. Look at how she has it. She has it perfectly.
Well, she's already not doing it full size.
That's fine. Trim this if you'd like. Sorry, but you want to. Yeah, there's a paper trimmer in the back. Okay.
Okay.
Where was I? So we're going to do a lecture today, a big assignment, creating texture, and we're also going to learn a technique for an exercise. It's how to trace or vectorize a photograph in Illustrator. So this is something some of you might be like, why didn't you show us this earlier? The reason why I don't is because I think it becomes kind of a hindrance, and students tend to hang on to it, and then all of their stuff becomes vectorized, and I don't think it's a good base for learning all these other tools and techniques. Okay, so we're going to start with a quick lecture on texture. So what is texture? It is a tactile quality of a surface. Okay, think about what something feels like, what a sweater feels like, what some stone feels like, carpet, a smooth screen of a computer, linoleum. Okay, or it's also the representation of the quality of a surface. So when print or on a screen, you can't literally feel anything but the smooth paper. So you have the texture of the paper or the screen itself, but there can be a visual representation for texture, and that's what we talk about in this class. They are seen or felt, stimulated both mental and physical associations, which help to increase the message of your communications, right? So when we see a certain texture, we have like an emotional, mental connection, which we relate to a physical experience with a texture. So if you look at a picture of rock, okay, or in this case, some sort of tactile thing that represents rock, you can kind of imagine the 3D quality, the rough kind of sandstone texture, or whatever kind of rock you've encountered in your life, because you have this experience in the world touching rock at some point, okay? And when you start to stimulate this sense of touch and this idea of texture, it helps to connect the viewer of your work or the target audience in a way that can really help them connect to the piece. Plus, it can help create more visual interest. It's more interesting to look at than just a plain smooth texture all the time. So if you mix some textures up and you play around with combinations, you can start to create something that's very visually exciting to look at. So types of texture, we talked about visual. Okay, so the impression. When we look at this picture of paper here, we can't really feel it, but we can get this idea visually of what that's going to feel like, okay? And then you also have tactile texture, the actual quality and feeling of the texture. And then you have the paper or the substrate in which your design is printed on, which also contributes to the texture. So if you print on a really smooth coated paper, which means it has like a chemical coating on it that makes it really smooth to the touch, that will feel one way. If you have a raw handmade paper where you can really feel the fibers of the paper and it maybe has a deckled edge or a torn edge, you know, that has a much different quality. Thin paper versus thick. What do all these different tactile impressions make when you're holding a piece in your hand? So that's something to also think about when it comes to texture. So finding texture, creating texture. There is texture everywhere. You look anywhere, you can find some sort of texture. The carpet, the computer screen, you walk outside, you see the grass, you see the asphalt, you see sand, ocean, okay? You can find a visual texture everywhere you look, okay? And you can capture these in many different ways. And for this next assignment, you guys are actually going to start to capture your own textures, because having a texture library with high resolution images or textures will help you in your creativity and in your design process. Because sometimes you just want a little bit extra to make something feel like it's vintage or worn, or you want it to have a rustic wood, like worn wood feeling, or you want something to look really fluffy and soft, okay? So if you start to catalog and collect all of these textures, then you're going to have something that you can use at any time when you're designing, okay? So you can photograph textures. You can walk out, take a macro lens and zoom in. You can use your iPhone. Start photographing textures and collecting those. You can also scan textures in. So sometimes you find a really great fabric that you like and you think, wow, I love the color. I love how that looks. I'd love to use that in a set of business cards. Slap it down on the scanner and scan it. Take tinfoil, crinkle it up, scan it. Try all kinds of different things and see what happens and start to collect those textures. And then you can actually start to create your own textures as well. So personally, I like to paint. I paint for fun at home, okay? And I like to use watercolor. And I have collected and created a huge range of watercolor textures that I use, which happens to be totally in right now, which works for me. So I have clients, people who come to me and they want me to create a wedding invitation suite and they want to use a watercolor texture background. Or I just had somebody come to me, she wanted to have custom-made prints for her baby's room. Okay, so I had this beautiful watercolor wash that I did that had texture on a really stubbly paper, scanned it in, and then I turned it into a little pink flamingo guy. So she had like matching flamingos to go up in her baby's room. I had those textures created from past watercolor days where I just made a bunch of textures, and I knew exactly which one I wanted to use. And so what you can do is you can actually like slop paint down on paper. You can start using crayons and pastels, put thick acrylic paint down. You could try smearing clay on surfaces and kind of just see what you get. And then you scan them in. I recommend scanning if you want a really high quality image to be used in design, because you can make sure you're getting a high resolution, a really clean, even light on your piece. You know, in this class we take pictures of the sketches with our phones, and that's fine, okay, because we're not really going to use those sketches anywhere necessarily. But if you wanted to use something, I always recommend you scan it, and we have scanners here, okay. The character, quality, and amount used should be connected to the message that is being communicated within the design. So how do you plan on using the texture? You can't just slap grass texture onto something that has nothing to do with the outdoors. Or maybe you want to use texture in a way to give a little bit of texture to the background of a piece. But if you use something that's like really, really heavy and it seems like it's not going with like a lightweight theme, so maybe you're doing something for like a baby's room, for instance, you know, you want to make sure that the texture is adding to the message of your piece, not taking away from it. So it's that main visual message we talk about. What are we communicating? The texture is an addition. When you're designing, you don't just add stuff because. Everything that you add should have a reason. The font you use, the color you use, the texture you use. Why are you adding it? Okay, is it going to create more visual interest? Is it adding to the message of a really fun, upbeat, interesting print ad? Okay, or is it going to be really somber and you need something that looks like a prison cell, like dark concrete or something? Those are the things you have to think about with your texture and in design. So here's an area of some examples of created texture, okay? Dry brushing with a brush with some watercolor, wet paper, so you wet your whole paper with your brush, and then you start to drip diluted paint or ink or watercolor right down on the paper, and you kind of create that. Same here. You can put wet paint down, and you can put some, if it's a watercolor, if it's anything like acrylic or oil, it will dry to it. But if you put something like saran wrap on top, let it dry, peel it off, you get this really cool kind of crackly look. Cheesecloth is great with watercolor, okay? You can also take a piece of paper, put it down on top of a texture, and take charcoal or a crayon and kind of sketch out really lightly. It's called a rubbing, and you can pick up some really cool textures that way. Okay? So in conjunction with texture, you also have this idea of pattern. And pattern and texture can kind of be synonymous at some points. So pattern is a consistent repetition of a visual element. Okay, so you have polka dots on a shirt, or you might have stripes or a floral pattern, something like that, where you have like a repeat of the same visual across the entire surface. And pattern in and of itself can help create a visual texture. So here we have a representation of a pattern, right? We have these lines that come down. But this pattern also helps to create a little bit of visual texture within our piece. So that's where you can start to see overlap. And what pattern will do is it will kind of create this orderly visual background or backdrop to something, okay? And it can help bring in some more visual interest. And pattern will help to decorate, but it also will help to draw your eye and bring more visual interest to your piece. Patterns tend to be really kind of rhythmically ordered, okay? So that rhythm that you see is very attractive to the eye, and it will tend to keep your eye interested in the visual for a long period of time. Okay, so here's some more examples. All right, so that's texture and pattern. Any questions about that? I like texture, can you tell? It's exciting. Okay, you guys are going to have fun with this assignment. Okay, next up is visual hierarchy, which is really, really important in design. Okay, does anybody know what visual hierarchy is? Kelly?
It's the order of where the viewer goes with your eyes, like where you're going to focus your eyes first, and then what comes next, and then what follows, and there's always
Exactly.
visual hierarchy to everything, but you have to be strategic and how you set it up.
Exactly. So visual hierarchy, where does your eye go first, second, third? How does that map out in your piece? And it helps to give a sense of importance to different visuals in the design, okay? So you can start to attract the viewer through a piece. This is incredibly important if you're trying to communicate a specific message in an ad, for instance, okay? What are you trying to get the person to do? So here's a really fun example of visual hierarchy. This cat shadow with this bulldog. Where does your eye go first? What was it?
To the cat.
To the cat shadow, right? And then where next? Dog. And then down here, right? To the message and to the product. So you can see how in this case we're using certain techniques and tricks to get the eye to go to something first. Okay? And one of those tricks is scale, how big something is. If something's really large, your eye's going to go there first. Okay? Another thing to think about is position on the format. So your eye goes to the big shadow first. It takes up a lot of the skill, okay? And then it's going to come down to this guy, right? Kind of almost in the center of the page. Your eye goes there. Then next, your eye travels down to a contrasting color, okay, and white space. And there's also a flow here that brings your eye through with how this shadow kind of cuts across, okay? So graphic design, it's about organizing information visually. If every element on a design is of the same exact visual weight, we talked about visual weight, how weighty something looks visually, the eye doesn't know where to go. You have to have pieces that stand out a little bit more to get your eye to go there first. Okay, so the reader doesn't become confused. Okay, the viewer has an idea of where their eye is supposed to go through the design. The organization of information can be found in an ad. It can be found in a brochure. It can be found on a poster or on a website, which is one of the most interactive design elements that most of us run into on a daily basis, right? You have to know where to go. You have to have some sort of visual hierarchy in a website, or how are you going to find what you need? Okay, so there's some really crappy websites out there, and I'm sure you've seen them before, where you're not really sure where the main navigation is, or there's competing navigation on the side, and everything's like bright and flashing, and it's going to give you a flipping seizure. So you're like, where do I click? Because everything is just so crazy that you don't have a visual that's telling you, click here first. Okay?
Sounds like a city college website.
It's 100%. I'm totally in agreement with you. I actually know someone who works in marketing here, so. Okay, so we tend to see elements in a composition in terms of planes, and we've talked about this before. So you have the foreground, which is usually the subject, the background, okay? And then you have this middle ground area, and that's how we tend to see things. So we almost always tend to see things in the foreground first, that main subject, and then our eye will travel, okay? And the foreground usually tends to be like it's the closest object to the viewer, whereas the background is part of the picture or the pattern or the shape and color that appears in the distance or behind most of the information. And the middle ground is the intermediate position in between. So in this case, I would say that this shadow is the midground, okay? And even though this dog is the subject and it's more in the foreground, your eye is going to still be drawn to that shadow first because of the scale. So here's another example. It is a high chair stacked up as high as it can go with cigarette butts. And then it says if you smoke around your children, they can inhale the equivalent of 102 packs of cigarettes by age 5. Okay? So the first thing your eye goes to before you even read this is this graphic that's using scale. Okay? It's using position to draw your eye right there. It's that first foreground subject matter. Okay, you're shocked by what it is. And then the flow down, you see the subhead, the headline here of the information. Okay. Understanding how an audience reads will help you understand how your piece is being viewed and where you have captured the audience's attention. So we tend to read from left to right. Okay, so the upper left-hand corner is where the eye tends to go first. So if you bring something up there and it captures the eye, then it will help pull you down. Okay. Then, I've talked about this before, center orientation, putting something smack dab in the center of a page also grabs your attention right away. It's kind of how we're hardwired when we look at a format. And part of it, I think, too, is like how we have been hardwired to look at human faces. You know, we look straight on at something. First thing we see is the face, okay? And then your eye tends to navigate around that same visual idea within the format of your design. And then we also have this idea of diagonals or flow that can bring the eye through a piece. Okay, so you start up here and you kind of zigzag down. Okay, same with this one with the high chair. Maybe your eye kind of starts up here and then you flow down to the bottom. So you have these diagonals and zigzags, the way the leg of this chair kind of brings your eye down and vice versa. Okay, so that helps lead you through. So here's another example. It's a little cartoon. Can't bring it up any more than that. But you guys can see your eye starts here, upper left-hand corner, and you kind of read through, and then you have this flow of all the pieces. Okay? So that's visual hierarchy. When it comes to this next assignment, which is about texture, we are going to really have to think about the visual hierarchy in the piece. So if you guys want to navigate to this new texture assignment that you're going to have, essentially what you're doing is you're going to accumulate a little library of texture images, and you're going to create a composition with a subject matter of your choice utilizing texture in the piece. And in many of these cases, the texture is a really the main focus, okay? And you'll see some different examples. So while we have all this different texture, we have to think about how we use texture and pattern in a way that still creates visual hierarchy. If you have pieces of your assignment that are competing with one another visually, and texture tends to be highly competitive, okay? Because the eye goes to it very often. It's very interesting. It has a lot of visual weight to it, depending on what it is. So you can see that you have to find a texture that is going to fit in with everything else, and you create the sense of visual hierarchy. But you also want the texture to fit in terms of the scale and proportion, because if you have it blown up too big, your eye might be drawn there first. So here's an example of a student piece, and they had chose to do the entire water feeling of this fishbowl in a texture. Okay, so you guys can all kind of see that, right? How there's like this crushed paper texture in the background of these fish. If this texture was any more detailed, if the paper was scrunched even more, if it had way more going on, it would be directly competing with these fish. Okay, So we're trying to make sure we're using the color, the proportion and scale, and the type of the texture in a way that doesn't make it too competitive. Okay, so you guys have to start thinking about this as you're going to work on this assignment and start to collect your texture. So visual hierarchy, size, color, shape, okay, those things can all lend to whether or not your eye goes there first. Okay, so let's talk about this assignment. So what you're going to do, exercises, per usual. You're going to go into your sketchbook and you're going to start to play around with creating texture. Okay? So I want you to create what we call 2 different texture quilts. This is a part of your grade for the main assignment, and it's actually going to take a lot of time to do it well, because you want to create high quality, high resolution textures or capture them that you can use for your piece. You do not have to use all of the textures you create for your final piece, but you're going to create these 2 different texture quilts to start. So quilt number 1, project 1, is you're going to create 16 to 24 original texture swatches. Most students tend to do 16. So you have 3" by 3" squares, okay, that make up 16, 4 by 4 to make 16 swatches, okay? And in order to do this, you can do like what I talked about in the lecture. Hand rubbings, okay, dry brushing, painting, crinkling up paper, scanning it in, grabbing a bunch of leaves and smushing them and creating crumbles, scanning that on, playing with all kinds of different materials that you're going to hand create and scan and put together into this quilt. Okay, here are some different options. You can do some really, really soft textures by doing chalks and rubbings. Okay, you can create rough feeling textures by using a dry brush or scratching the surface of the paper, crunching the paper up. Slippery, you can use wet paint or magic markers and kind of smear them around with water and see how that looks. And motion, you can create the illusion of motion, running your hand through paint or erasing like a whole area of charcoal that you put down and kind of creating this illusion. Okay? You can drop ink from up above and have it land below. You can create a whole range of handmade textures this way. Okay? Then, for the quilt number 2, project 2, you're going to collect or take photographs, digital images, to create your second quilt. So, quilt 1, handmade textures. A picture of macaroni and cheese is not a handmade texture. Literally, it's happened before. Okay? If you were to paint with the macaroni and cheese on a piece of paper, that's one thing. But a picture of the macaroni and cheese goes into quilt number 2, which is the digital textures that you're going to create. So take some pictures, get up close, okay? You can find ones on the web, high resolution ones, make sure they're large scale, okay? And then you're going to manipulate those in Photoshop or Illustrator, apply different filters and play around with textures. You can also create your own textures for the digital quilt just in Photoshop. So you can create clouds in Photoshop. There's different filters and techniques. You can start by putting down solid amount of color and tweaking that to create a different kind of texture. Okay, so those are digital, and then you have your handmade ones. So every texture that you create, my recommendation is to not make it any smaller than 8.5 by 11 inches. Okay. So if you're going to do it, get a big piece of paper and do your entire rubbing or your entire sketch. Because even though you are going to fit it into a quilt that's only 3 inch by 3 inch square, you may want to use that texture for your final piece. And if you have one that's too small, you're not going to get it to fit in. Does that make sense? So if we create a texture that's this big, a 3 inch by 3 inch square, but you want to use it to be the entire background of your fishbowl, it's not going to fly. Okay? So this student, this looks like a square. Maybe this is a a 10 inch by 10 inch square, for instance. You can't take a little tiny scan and blow it up this big without messing up and having the resolution look really, really crappy. So try to make your textures as big as possible. When you photograph and scan, you can adjust the resolution a little bit, especially with photography. You can take a really huge picture. Okay? If you have it up at full resolution, you know, you can have a picture that's over 30 inches by 30 inches. So once you've created your texture quilt, which is going to take some time, okay, because you have to go out and you have to start creating these things, and you have to start documenting them digitally or scanning them in. If you have some materials and stuff that you want to bring into class to scan next week, don't forget to bring them, okay? So you're going to spend time doing that. And then the last part of the project is to actually create a composition with a subject utilizing all of the textures. So it's your choice, whatever you want to do, but you're going to have to think about how the texture is going to contribute to your overall message. Okay? Sometimes students prefer to collect all their textures first and see what their options are before they go and mess around and create their idea for their subject. So you might want to start with your textures first and experiment.
So I need to use all the textures that I collected in my final piece?
No, you don't. You do not. But by having a range, you give yourself many more options for how you're going to utilize them.
Sure.
I think you mentioned this for the digital project too. You have to you can't scan any of your hand done textures, right?
Yes, you're going to have to scan them in. How else are you going to get them into your digital piece?
Oh, I thought you were meaning do 16 to 24 brand new textures
For project 1,
for project 2.
yes. So you have 16 to 24 handmade and 16 to 24 digital. So
And
your
they're
quilt
completely separate.
completely separate. So let's look at some examples. Okay.
Then I mix two of them to create a composition, the final composition.
You don't have to, you can use a mixture of any of them to create your final composition.
Or I can use just texture from like that I collect.
Yeah.
Put it in.
Even if you don't put it in the quilt, you can use other texture. Okay. I'm not going to be like, oh, you didn't use all of the texture, or this texture wasn't in your quilt. I don't care. I want you to pick a texture that's appropriate for your design. Okay. Per usual, got a cover page that talks about brainstorming and a little quick sketch here to show some texture. Then we have the handmade textures, rubbings, paint smear. Looks like primarily a lot of rubbing, some paint that's dripped down, some dry brushing, okay? That's the handmade stuff. Then it's scanned in. And this student went and actually applied little sticky notes in Adobe Acrobat Pro. It's not going to show me because I have it opened up in the browser, but if you download this and you open it in your Acrobat Pro, you should be able to read them. But the student decided to tell me exactly where these were created, okay? Then the next step, these are the digital ones. Zoom in on some old leather. A picture of a flower zoomed in close. That helps create visual texture. Some of these are downloaded from the web. Some of them are actually taken. I think this is cheddar cheese. That's my guess. What do you guys think? Shredded cheese or shredded carrots. It's orange. Strawberries. This looks like some sort of hive-like thing, almost maybe like a heater or something. Like, look for the texture and all kinds of weird stuff. Did you guys ever get that magazine when you were a kid growing up called Highlights Magazine? And they always have, and you have to try to guess what it is that's zoomed in so tight. And you're like, what the hell is it? And then you look on the back and it tells you it's something like totally random. It's like Grandma's couch. So look at things differently. Find the texture, okay? So then the student talks about the process, okay? Santa Barbara says like he was a big city boy, like really likes the city, and that's where he's going to get his inspiration. Playing around with different shapes, okay? And here is the final piece. So this is primarily done in Photoshop. You have a lot of different options. I know this one's awesome. Obviously, a lot of Photoshop skills happening here. But you can see how the student thought about different textures, varying the color, and giving everything its own place to stand so it doesn't feel like anything's particularly overwhelming. Here's that flower, that center of the flower. Played around in Photoshop, brightened up in adjustments, made it really, really bright and yellow. Okay, so you just have layers and layers. Here's that honeycomb looking like heater type element, right? Layering things in and playing around. You can see that you don't have textures that are stacked on top of each other on their own in this case. They've chosen to apply a white stroke, which helps to kind of differentiate and delineate the different items in the collage, okay? So that's one way to do it. Let's look at another one. And you can see a face actually inside of these birds here. Do you guys see that? The eyeballs and the lips. Okay, creating texture. Texture quilt. So this student didn't do the quilt perfectly, but it's a good example of a range of options, okay? And then you can see these are all the different hand-painted ones. Oh, see right here. Here's an example. Upper right-hand corner, cheesecloth. So watercolor, and you get a piece of cheesecloth, and it kind of like sucks into all of the little fibers, and you stretch it out. And then playing around with paint splatters, dry brushing, a charcoal rubbing. Okay, there's a lot of different things that you can do. And also sketch out your ideas in your sketchbook. Okay, it's not a huge requirement of this project, but it is something that I'm trying to get you guys to adhere to, where you have some sort of basic plan, a blueprint of how you're going to create your layout. So you can see here, this student chose to do a sketch, scan it in, bring it into Illustrator, and apply a clipping mask. So how many of you guys did that text exercise last week? And remember we did the clipping mask where you put a photo in your name? Same thing here, okay? So that's why you should do the exercises. Then the student went into Photoshop and began playing around with motion and doing some little different effects with the brushes in there, okay, to create more texture. So the texture doesn't just have to come from the visual textures themselves. You could play around with creating brush strokes and other textures within the design programs as well. Okay, and you can see then a background was put in. Oh, here we go. Here are the final projects. And here's the final piece. So the subject can be whatever you want. But you can see in terms of this subject, you have like this natural looking face blowing in the wind. You want it to look like it's like she's a little bit sad, like something's happening. So they chose muted color palettes, played up that idea of like this windswept or kind of like caught in the rain look. And then you can see how the background image, that texture, is not too heavy to overwhelm the subject. Okay, so you have to make sure that there's the visual hierarchy is there, that you have enough contrast between the two. Okay. Should we look at one more? Let's see if this one works. There we go. Okay, doing some research, brainstorming, sketches, composition, mapping out where all the texture is going to go, playing around in Photoshop. Here are the quilts. This is just ink scribbled down, pen strokes. Okay. And then here's this final piece. Okay. So you can get as simple or as complex as you want. This face of the woman is actually a very, very simple basic shapes, okay, that she hand traced her sketch in, which we've done, right? We've played around with tracing the koi or the lemon, so we know exactly how to use a pen tool to kind of create that shapes. And then this student just wanted to elevate it to the next level by using Photoshop. You don't have to do that. You can do this all in Illustrator if you want, or you can choose to explore Photoshop, which I think is a fun exercise for you guys to play around in a little bit. You can also use Photoshop to manipulate your photos a little and create like different colors and mess around. Any questions about this assignment? When is it due? And what do you bring to class in 2 weeks? The print.
It's just all three.
I only want to see your final piece. Does it seem like a fun assignment? Yes? It's very fun. Trust me. You guys are going to get your hands a little dirty. You're going to have fun. And the textures are going to get you excited about what it is that you're going to do for your final piece. So I think what I want to show you guys is how you can set up your quilt in InDesign. And then maybe we should go over Photoshop a little bit. And I can show you how you can manipulate some photos in Photoshop to create different colors and things like that. Sound good? Okay, so I'm going to launch InDesign. Let's see if it works. Navigate towards your photo in Photoshop. Let's find something. And then I'm going to show you how you can apply some different filters and mess around to enhance your texture in your photos if you wanted to, or if you pull something from the web, vice versa. This is slow. So as a reminder, Photoshop uses pixels or bitmap graphics to construct the image, okay? So whatever changes you're making, you're essentially painting or changing something to do with the pixels themselves in the image. It's not like in Illustrator where you have the Bezier curves and this vector graphic with the anchor points that you can apply these effects to over and over again really easily. It's a little bit more complicated in Photoshop. And I try to liken it as like digital paint on paper, okay? So if you have green paint down on paper and you want to change the color, you have to paint over it. It's not like you can just select it and swap the color easily in Illustrator. So I've opened up this image in Photoshop, and I want to make sure that it's a large size image because we want it to be at least 8.5 inches by 11 inches at 300 ppi. So you want to go image, image size. This will allow you to see the physical dimensions of your photo or your scan, okay? In this case, you can see it's about 10.5 inches by 7.5 inches at a resolution of 72. So this is actually a pretty small image. I'm going to uncheck resample, and I'm going to say, what does this look like at 300 pixels per inch? It's only 2.5 inches by 1.8 inches, so this is really small. Okay, so you want to make sure that you're going to start with an image that's over 8.5 inches by 300. You want to make sure that you uncheck resample when you translate from 72 to 300. What it does is it's reducing the size, and you guys are actually going to be doing a little exercise on this, I think next week. It reduces the size of the image because you have to constrict all of those pixels per inch down, okay, to be a little bit tighter. So always uncheck that. So we know that this image is not high enough resolution for this assignment, but for the sake of demonstrating, I'm going to continue and show you what I'm doing.
Sorry, how'd you get the photo there?
I went File, Open, and I found the photo on my computer. Okay. So I'm going to zoom in here. And you can see how leaf texture could be a really great texture to work with. Okay. So in Photoshop, Photoshop works with layers. So as you start to build things and you start to manipulate, layers are going to be thrown in there. Okay. Think of it as stacking. if you add any kind of what's known as an adjustment layer to your piece, it's going to put that on top and it's going to apply those rules to everything. So this is a way to change some color. So I'm going to show you a fun adjustment layer. So if you go to adjustments in your panel, you can always find any of your work panels in your window menu. Okay, so if you go to adjustments, for instance, it's going to open up. Adjustments has a range of things that you can manipulate. If you roll over any of these icons, it's going to tell you what it does. Hue and saturation adjustment. Okay, brightness and contrast. Levels, which is tweaks like how dark or how light the light and darks are in a photograph. Okay, same with curves. And then there's a bunch of different other options you can play with. So let's play around with hue and saturation adjustment layer for now, because this would be a fun way to manipulate the color. Opens up the panel, okay, and then you can choose to play around with the actual hue. Okay, so that's one way. You can increase the saturation, or how rich the color is, with the saturation bar here, and you can play around with the lightness or the darkness. Okay, you can also colorize, which means that it's going to take whatever color you have chosen and it's going to make a black and white tints and shades version of that image. Okay, so I'm going to turn that off. Alright, so now we have a purple tree. Another thing you can do in Photoshop is you can play around with filters. If you go to your filters menu, you have a range of filter options to choose from here. Okay, you can distort. Let's see what happens if we play with pinch. I'm going to reduce this window here so I can see what we're doing. I don't think it's going to show me. But you can see in this little preview guy right here how you can kind of distort the image that way. So let's see what happens if I do that. Oh, okay. The reason why we couldn't see the image is because I was working on my hue and saturation layer. Okay, that's why we couldn't see it. You want to make sure you're working on the layer that has the actual photos. Let's go back to filter. We'll go back to, what was it? Distort, pinch. Okay, now you can see what happens. You can play around that way. Okay. Filter, you can play with the noise, which is how much noise or little like pixelated dots you have happening. Sometimes you would see noise in like old photographs, for instance. So if you add noise, it kind of looks a little pixelated. If you go too much, it looks, reminds me of like when your TV was like not getting a signal. Okay, so that counts as texture. Okay. Again, if you're applying it to this layer with the image, everything that you're doing here is kind of getting stuck. Okay. What you can do if you don't like something, you can do Command Z and undo it. Okay. Or you can always go to what's called your history panel in Photoshop. Yes, Ellen?
Yeah, I usually like duplicate the layer that has the photograph in it and work in a copy instead,
yes,
so that I can just throw it away if I don't like it.
I think that is a really good idea. So if you open up your image, you may want to duplicate that layer first by clicking and dragging it to this little layer icon, and it will duplicate it. So then you can always work on one, so you always have your original image untouched sitting there. Okay. But here's your history panel, and if you were to click back, you could really get to the original image. I think in CC you can adjust in your preferences how far back your history goes. Like in Photoshop, the default, I think it only allows you to go back a certain amount of steps. So you can adjust it in your preferences if you want to do that. Okay, so then another thing you can do is go to Filter, and you can go to this Filter Gallery. And you can see a whole range of options in here as well. This is all creating interesting texture that you can use. So, ooh, that's cool. I love that. So let's click that. And then you can see it's applied it to this layer. I'm going to double click on the hand to fit everything in. That looks like a little paint daub painting now, huh? Yeah.
Can those filters count as one of our digital pictures?
Absolutely. Any of those digital images, if you take a picture or you pull something from the web, if you do this, this counts as digital. You can even start with scratch. You could start with File, New. Okay, let's make this 8.5 by 11 inches. You want to make sure the resolution's at 300. And for these printers, you know, you guys should get in the habit of using CMYK for printers if you're going to print something, okay? RGB is usually a screen color profile. So then you can come in, you can get your shape tool. You want to set the fill. We can create a shape. Okay, it's going to go on its own layer. Then if we come to filter, you can start to play around and see what happens. So if you go to render, you can start by going to something like clouds, flame, picture frame, and see what happens. So let's play around with difference clouds. The shape layer must be rasterized or converted to a smart object before proceeding. So a smart object means it's an editable object. If it's rasterized, it means you're turning it into just pixels. Okay, so we're going to rasterize this. Okay, so now we've created some digital clouds, and then we could come into your hue and saturation and maybe lighten these up. Let's see what happens if we go back to render. Oh yeah, go back and let's make a new guy. You can also turn layers on or off, and you can see how in the adjustment layers it's not going to show you what's underneath there. So let's do like a red color. I want to see what this flames does. Get red, filter, render, flame. Not directly editable, so I'm going to right click and I'm going to say rasterize layer. Go back to filter. A selected path is required to use this filter. Okay, so that's not working for me. But you can see how you guys can play around in here and experiment and create whatever it is that you want. Let's go down here. Why isn't that working? Filter, blur gallery. Okay. But you guys can get that idea where you can go around to all these different filters and adjust it that way. Okay? So once you have all of your filters, what you want to do is you want to set up your quilts. Okay? So in the texture assignment, it tells you 16 to 24 originals, and they need to be 3 inches by 3 inch swatches. So if we did the math, 3 times 4 is, okay, so that would make a 12 by 12 square, exactly. So how I would set this up, I would do, I'm going to close this, File, New Document, turn off facing pages, okay. I want 2 pages here for my quilt. I'm going to make these 12 inches, and I'm going to turn my margins off. So I'm just going to make sure I don't have any margins, because we don't need them, because we're going to butt all the way up to the edge. And I'm going to click OK. So then we have our 2 squares. You can do a couple different things. You can actually pull guidelines. I'm going to go View. Ruler should be showing. Oh, let's see. Oh, there we go. You can pull guidelines by clicking and dragging directly from your rulers, and you can line them up every 3 inches. That's one way to do it. And back down this way. Okay. Did that drag? Here we go. Okay, so then you have your squares. Or you can do this way, where you click on your frame tool, and I'm going to go ahead and just click once. And it's going to open up this option for you to set the size of your rectangle frame. I want 3 inches by 3 inches, and I'm going to hit OK. I'm going to just kind of drag this into place and use any kind of the guides that I have set in place. Then I'm going to duplicate this frame by holding down the Option Alt key and clicking and dragging, clicking and dragging, clicking and dragging. Select all of these, hold down Alt Option, click and drag, click and drag, click and drag. Okay, so then you have your frames already set to load in your graphics. So if I click on this guy and I have my scanned handmade textures in there, I'm going to do the shortcut command, Command D, or you can do a file place. And then you're going to go ahead and you're going to find your texture and you're going to place it in your frame. And then you can continue on. Command D, place. Command D, place. It's pretty easy, right? Okay, so that part we got down. So that's cool. So that's how you're going to create your quilt. It's pretty straightforward. Think about making things look good. Okay, so if you don't like the way something's looking within the frame, grab the donut and mess around with how it's shining through its bounding box. Because maybe you really want it to look, you want the most contrast maybe between your different patches in your quilt. So you can rearrange things, you can mess around that way, but we're designers now, so we want to make sure that it looks nice. Maybe you want to make sure there's contrast and some sort of difference between each of the ones that butt up against each other. That's just what I would do. Okay, so next we're going to talk about how you can create a clipping mask to create your final piece. There's two ways to do it. One is in Illustrator, and then you can kind of also do it in InDesign, well, and you can also do it in Photoshop. But we'll just start with Illustrator because you guys have all had a little bit of experience in here, and we played with a clipping mask in the last exercise. So I'm going to open up a new file. When you think about your final piece that you're going to do, think about the size. So what's the maximum size we can print in class? 11 by 17. So that's the maximum you can print here. If you were to go, if you wanted to do something that's larger scale, which is totally cool. So Kelly, you had big dreams of doing a 32-inch, which is awesome. But if you go to, if you were to go to a printer, if you were to go to Kinko's and tell them that you wanted 32 inches, they probably would have been able to accommodate you. Okay? It wouldn't have been on standard white paper. Maybe it's on photo paper. It depends on what size they have available. Paper comes in standard sheet sizes, 8.5 by 11, 11 by 17, 11 by 14, 22 by 28 inches, okay? And then you kind of have weird shapes and sizes after that. So not every printer is going to have exactly what you want, but if you call them ahead of time, you say, look, I have something that's 32 inches by 5 inches. Do you have this available? Maybe you have to print on vinyl. Maybe you have to print on the photo paper, but there's different options. So think about what your final subject piece is going to be, what size. So in this case, I'm going to make this 8.5 by 11 inches in Illustrator. I'm going to set my orientation to be horizontal because that's how I'm envisioning what I'm going to do. And I'm going to go ahead and open this up. Okay, so somebody give me some sort of subject matter here. Anything. Come on. Beach. Beach. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to use my paintbrush tool and I'm going to create some waves. That looks beautiful. And then I want to create the sun and do some rays. And I'm making sure to close off all of my shapes. So if I come in here with my black arrow tool, you can see how I have these vector graphics created. Now all you have to do is create what's called a clipping mask. And that is basically where you layer an image on top of a vector and it basically takes like a little like cookie cutter shot of it. But not really. You're not losing any of the information of the original. It's just being, all you can see is being clipped or cut away from your line of sight. So let's fill in our sun. I'm going to go ahead and say File, Place. And I'm going to find my texture, and I'm going to click and drag and place it down. And I'm going to send this to back. This is the one thing that I always tend to forget is whether or not your photograph has to be on top or your vector graphic. Okay, so it's going to warn me, it's going to let me know. So I want to select my sun rays, and I want to select my yellow texture, and I'm going to right click and say make clipping mask, and it's filled it in. So what you can do is if you use your white arrow, you can kind of, let's see, are you going to work for me? You should be able to select, there we go. If you kind of have it highlighted and then you click, you should be able to select and arrange your texture within it. Okay, so the next up, what we didn't grab, I'm going to select it with my black arrow, send it to the back, and then I'm going to select my middle portion of my sun. I want to do file place, get this guy, click and drag. Let's do this. Let's pull these off here. If you ever have this isolation mode happen, you can just click these arrows to get out. Sometimes it happens in Illustrator. So I'm going to work on this off of there to make it as uncomplicated as possible. Send my vector graphic to the back. I'm going to marquee around both. Right click, make clipping mask. Okay, so what we want is we want the vector on top. So send my image to the back. Select both. Right click, make clipping mask. And then I can bring my center of my sun to the front here. I'm going to arrange and bring it to the front. Boom. Texture sun. I mean, it looks like a 2-year-old did it, but you know, whatever. And then same with my ocean. You can do file place. When you're working at home, you can set your shortcut commands for almost anything that you want. So Command D tends to be the file place command that we use a lot in InDesign. So if you wanted to set that preference to other software, you have that option to do it. Okay, let's go in here, get our ocean texture, click and drag, send it to the back, select both, right click, make clipping mask. So you can see how you can start to layer and create your objects. Now, if we were to place a scan in and we really wanted to zoom in tight, you might have an issue where the resolution may not be working out perfectly. Because if you're zooming in too close to get that texture, because you really want it to look really, really detailed, you might be zooming in too close, and what you're essentially doing is expanding your image as large as you possibly can in order to see that texture. So you have to be careful of how you're doing it. Test printing is good because you want to make sure that the resolution looks nice. I will say that in the case of the texture assignment, sometimes pixelated looking photographs can actually add some texture, okay? But if it looks fuzzy and it looks like a crappy picture that you blew up from the web, we're all going to be able to tell when we look at the final piece. Okay? The other thing you can do in InDesign, and this is like a little cheat version, the reason why I don't like doing it in InDesign is because you have less flexibility with some of the drawing tools. But if you were to come in with your pen tool, for instance, and you were to create your own shape, I don't really know what this is, tortellini. Okay, and then I do Command D and I place within this. You're kind of doing the same idea with the clipping mask, okay? So if you want to do it all in InDesign, you could. You just don't have some of the really cool options like using a brush, coming in and getting your paintbrush tool. I'm going to use my brush panel here and let's see what we want. You know, you can create some additional texture. That counts as texture. Okay, it doesn't have to be just from the images that you've collected. You can come in and add texture with brushes and stuff. Same thing, you could take your basic Illustrator document, save it, open it up in Photoshop, and come in and apply some texture, apply some filters. Okay, there's a lot of different options that you can do. If you want to play around with different brushes, you can go to your Open Brush library. Artistic has some great ones. Chalk, charcoal, and pencil. These are really great for texture. So I'm going to use this guy. Let's change my color here. And you can start to apply some texture that way. That's cool, right? Fun. Think about all the possibilities. So the texture doesn't just have to be clipping masks, but I think it's a nice base to start. Okay. Be judicious in your choices for the texture. Okay. If you have a lot going on in your ocean waves and you were to put this on top of a sun, you might start to see a lot happening, and it's hard to differentiate where your eye is supposed to go, that visual hierarchy. So you can see how color, texture, how you zoom in affects everything. Okay. Any questions about creating the texture assignment? No. Okay. Any questions about the real to abstract assignment that we've been working on from last week? If you have missed class, you can watch the lecture in the index, which I recommend. You can speed through some of it and watch pieces of it. I didn't do any demonstrations of that assignment because it really was similar to tracing the koi and the lemon. So you're going to do sketches, you're going to abstract out your sketches, scan them in, and you're going to pick one or two to digitally work on, and you can kind of trace your sketches. But we're not going to trace the actual magazine ads that you're working with. And you'll understand what I'm saying when you read the assignment. Okay? Additional questions? No. Okay, so I'm going to stop recording, and then we're going to go into critique. So is this what we have for tonight? Yes. Yes, you can print yours.
Can I crop mine?
Yes, you can crop yours.
I have a question about, I thought I followed you and I right clicked to do the clipping thing and I don't see it as an option.
If you are, what are you working in?
You-
Inside.
is it in
Is that
here?
why?
Possibly.
Need to get it in here.
You may have, or do you have both items selected?
Yeah,
Go ahead.
yeah, I'm in design. I have both selected, right click.
Yeah, so it'll be in Illustrator that you'll see the clipping mask option, not in InDesign.
Okay.
Otherwise, you get my.
Okay.
posting.
No, I